Okay, thanks everyone for coming along today. I suppose it just shows that we, as Paul mentioned, we normally have this in our TASC offices, but there was a lot of interest in this, and I suppose it shows the depth of the crisis, but also, you know, the real interest in trying to find solutions, and I think a questioning of the existing policies that have been put forward. And this presentation that I'm giving today is part of ongoing research that I've been undertaking for a number of years in the area of housing and privatisation, and what is called this process of commodification and financialisation. And then within TASC, I've been looking at the particular angle of economic inequality within that. And really it's been at the heart of my research and work has been trying to understand why the crisis exists today, why these inequalities exist within the housing system, and what are the alternative policies that are available that could achieve a more human rights based or more equality based outcomes in terms of housing, and ensuring people's, ultimately their housing need is met as the primary outcome. So what I'm going to do today is kind of give an overview of kind of some indicators of inequality within housing in terms of the crisis, where it's at. A lot of you would be well aware of this. And then look at, kind of go into a bit of forensic detail in terms of the government's Rebuilding Ireland plan, and analyse it as to whether it will actually address this crisis. And when I do that, I suppose I'm putting the analysis in the context of housing policy that, as Paul mentioned, and I would argue, has really been pursuing this, what is called a neoliberal approach to housing since the 1980s, which is essentially one whereby the state's role is minimised from being a provider of public, social, local authority housing, a regulator of finance, of mortgage markets, to a deregulated system, a system where the state in actual fact spends a lot of money on subsidising the private sector and facilitating what is a much bigger trends within capitalism in terms of the role that housing plays as a kind of a source of wealth accumulation. And this is a really important thing that I'm kind of highlighting within the research, and is an area that requires further research if we look in the academic field of housing research, which is the role that housing has played in the wider political economy, which is in particular since the 1970s and 80s, this process of financialisation and the way housing has become a solution to that system. So what I'm going to look at is what evidence there is for these trends, and then what alternative policies are there. Now, the time is short, and I suppose the starting point is to say that the housing system, and in trying to give a presentation on the housing crisis in Ireland, it's so difficult, because you can't look at any one area, be it the private rental sector, social housing, home ownership, in isolation from the other, and of course the wider processes of housing as investment or housing as a home. And so in that sense, it's really hard to give a presentation that gives an overview, a sufficient overview, while trying to also give some level of depth of analysis. But I'll try it anyway, and apologies if I'm rushing too much through things, but you can ask me at the end. So obviously, you know, and it's the hardest, the most extreme end of housing inequality is homelessness. And we have seen just in the last few years the homelessness crisis really escalate to a point where it is a national emergency. You know, it's a scandal, it's a disgrace. You only have to, you know, walk down a lot of the streets in Dublin, you will see people who are homeless. And the statistics are startling when you look at them. I've put these together, comparing, for example, the number of homeless children in July 2014 in Dublin in comparison to just the most recent figures out yesterday. I was putting this together last night. You know, there's been an increase in 1,511 children homeless in that roughly 2.5 year period, which is a 258% increase. And I won't go into too much detail, but, and I haven't this here, but the impact of children on children of homelessness cannot be underestimated, and it has a huge psychological traumatic impact on them that lasts through their life, in terms of not just schooling impacts, but their whole sense of their own personal well-being is profoundly traumatized by an experience of homelessness. And within that, we are seeing children being, this increase in children really has to be just simply unacceptable. But we see there the total number is over 7,000 individuals homeless. If you add there the figures, the government said there was 2,700 what they call exits from homelessness last year. It gives you then an overall total of approximately 10,000 that is homeless individuals, including children, last year. If we look then at sort of go on beyond homelessness to look at the wider area of housing need, housing inequalities, we look at the housing waiting list. Now, the housing waiting list show, this is from the housing agency, show that the numbers between 2013 and 2016 increased from 89,000 households to 91,000 households. We see this very useful table here provided by the housing agency, which shows that if we look at Dublin City Council down the bottom, the area of one of the areas of highest increase in terms of actual numbers, the highest increase in households on the waiting list, local authority waiting list, from 16,000 to almost 20,000. And if we put this in the context of what's happened in Ireland over the last 10, 22 decades essentially, we see that in 1996 there was under 30,000 households on the housing waiting list. But this then increased during the Celtic Tiger, and within this we see this argument that, you know, the housing crisis has suddenly just been forced upon us and people weren't aware of it, policymakers weren't aware of it. The housing crisis, and I make this argument, that we're in now stems back to a housing crisis that existed during the boom, of course, which has its policies in this privatized neoliberal approach to housing, which really goes back to the reduction in investment in local authorities, social housing building, and the ability of local authorities to borrow to build. But we see the dramatic increase in the waiting list from 2008 to 2013 over the period of austerity. So in terms of then within these lists as well, you can go into it in more detail and see that some of the statistics in the most recent ones show, 2016 shows that those on housing lists for more than 7 years has increased from 9% of those on the waiting list to over 21%. And if you just pause for a minute, think 7 years on a housing waiting list, and what does that mean for a family and for individuals? And this is Olivia Kelly's article just there from earlier in January, an article sort of going through some case studies of the housing list. This is one woman and her children living in their room. So this is the reality of the housing crisis of the 90,000 households who are on the housing waiting list. There's other then indicators you can use to look at sort of the impact of the housing crisis of trying to get a picture of, because it is difficult to get a picture of how is the housing crisis affecting people, and particularly from an inequality perspective, because there is a lot of issue around statistics and the lack of statistics, and just in reference back to the housing waiting list there is an issue around the housing waiting list. Do they actually cover or give an accurate picture of the extent of housing need that's there, with some people claiming they were put off the list, councils writing out to people saying are they on the list or not, and there's questions around that. But this is statistics that I've taken from Eurostat and sort of drilled into them a bit. There's a particular, it comes from the EU Silk survey, which is called the housing cost over burden rate. And these are households whose proportion of their disposable income is considered a burden in terms of what's being spent on housing. Now what's interesting in these statistics is that Ireland actually comes out very low in terms of the overall burden, housing as a proportion of their income, that level of burden. So if we look at, for example, even, so we come out quite low. But so you have to drill down into those statistics because they're averages. And of course this is a big problem with statistics if you just look at averages rather than what is the situation for different groups. for different categories. So I took out from this the households who are on below 60% of the median equivalized income. That's basically they're on 60% of essentially what half the population's income is. And what you see within that is this trend of the overburden rate there in terms of household income increasing significantly from 2007, where roughly 12% of those households were overburdened by their housing costs, to increasing to up to 30% in 2012, dropping back to around 23%. But what's interesting when you look at inequality is when you compare that to households whose income is above 60% of the median income, and you see their housing cost burden is as low, only 2% of those households have this issue of a housing cost overburden. So it's clear that those who are really affected by the housing crisis are those in the lower income groups in terms of this idea of their overburden rate in terms of housing being a cost. And you can break that down further again, and I was looking through it, and if you look at those who are households who are below the 60% income and are in the age category of 25 to 29, and you see suddenly we go above the Euro average. In 2014, we see 50% of households who are in this category, that age group, who are below 60% of the income, are affected by their housing costs are an overburden on them, and we are above the Euro average. So we see that the impact of the housing crisis is on particular groups, particular age groups, and particular income groups in terms of the crisis, and I think they're very useful to show that, because it's very difficult, as I said, to find statistics which show how is the housing crisis affecting people. Another way to look at it in terms of inequality is looking at the quintiles. So this is the 20% of the population. So the first quintile, which is the bottom fifth of the population, we see that in Ireland in 2014, a fifth of those were affected by housing costs, essentially. If we look at the second quintile, which is the 20% above that, so you're talking about between 20 and 40%, that drops to 2.8%. For the top quintile, it's 1.9%. So essentially, housing costs as an issue are really affecting the lower income groups in society, and we see that as an inequality. Some of this you say is quite obvious. If you're in lower income categories, clearly housing costs are going to be a major issue. But that's not necessarily the case, and it is important to show the statistics that bear that out. Another major area then is the whole issue of mortgage arrears and what has happened in relation to that. And we can see this, the way in which the crisis really hit mortgage arrears in around 2013. But what has happened since then, and where is the situation now? And really the mortgage arrears situation has been described as, using Peter McVerry's phrase, as potential tsunami of homelessness. And these are central bank statistics that I've put together. And essentially taking out the main points of it, we can see that there's roughly 35,000 households who are on arrears of longer than 2 years, 720 days, their mortgage arrears, over 35,000. And we see within that has been increasing. So while the general number of households in arrears has been dropping, the number in long-term arrears has been increasing. We see also there the buy-to-let area, we see there's 26,000 buy-to-lets in arrears, and over 14,000 are over 720 days. Now that 14,000 figure is very significant because that's 14,000 properties that are currently being rented out, most likely. They could be vacant, they might not, but that's a potential 14,000 properties that could be repossessed. The 35,000 primary dwelling homes is 35,000 properties that could be repossessed. There are likely to be something is going to have to happen to them in the coming years. So you're talking about almost 50,000 housing units, potentially families becoming homeless in the next 2, 3, 5 years, or their housing situation will have to be dealt with. So when you talk about a tsunami of homelessness or housing crisis and housing need, there it is sitting there. So that's another area. The repossessions then, what is happening, we can see again that there's been what's considered a low level of repossession, but repossession has been happening nonetheless over the last 4 or 5 years. Roughly, I would calculate that there's been about 5,000 homes repossessed since 2012, about 25,000 legal proceedings issued. So this again is an area contributing to the housing crisis and homelessness. So, and looking at the big picture then as well and understanding what's happening to Ireland, housing systems don't change quickly. But in Ireland we have had a shock, a cataclysmic shock to our housing system. If you look at the change in home ownership rates in Ireland, put these together from the EU Silk, we have had the highest drop in any other European country in home ownership rates between 2007 and 2014. The only other country that had a similar drop to us was the United Kingdom, within the EU, soon not to be within the EU, but in terms of a European country. Iceland I've put in there as well as another example, but of course Iceland isn't in the EU. But Ireland has had the biggest drop in home ownership, along with the United Kingdom. The two countries that most closely followed the neoliberal, Thatcherite home ownership dream of everybody becoming a homeowner, housing being an asset, and yet these are the systems that have failed most drastically. And this is a dramatic change, this collapse in home ownership in such a short period of time. And within these, I don't have time to go into it today, but within these figures of home ownership, you can start to get a sense of the different housing systems across Europe, that we do have different forms of housing systems. So in Finland, in terms of the changes, the levels of home ownership, these are the higher levels. Sorry, I'll go give an example later on of the lower levels. But this, but I suppose at the heart of this is a longer trend that is happening. And within Rebuilding Ireland, it's stated quite clearly that, and this is a quote from it, that the incomes of many households are such that the aspiration to home ownership in the communities in which they come from is unlikely to be realisable. And there's this kind of policy acceptance and view that home ownership, for a significant portion of people that previously thought they would own a home or be able to buy a home, is no longer a possibility. And I don't think society has really taken on board the implications of that or what that means. And within that, of course, alongside that, we've seen the significant increase in the private rented sector, between 8.7% to 16%, that's tenant rent at market price. So this increase, and I'm going to move on in terms of, just to go through this. The other area, of course, inequality around housing is housing as wealth. And we see these central bank figures, and they're used a lot to look at household net worth. And part of household net worth, your housing asset is used to classify your worth. Now again, I would think these figures in some ways are completely useless because they're average figures. So we look at household net worth in Ireland, the figures show our wealth is increasing largely because property values have increased in the last 2 years or so. But of course, if you look at break that down and see, well, who does own their property? In the lowest, second lowest decile, bottom 20%, only 50% of people own their home. So this idea of wealth through an asset is meaningless for half those people. And then we see at the top, almost 90% own their home. But even more importantly, the value of the home, in terms of the top 10%, the median value of their home is €220,000, which is double those at the lowest end. So in terms of housing wealth, as house price increases, of course, the value of those houses at the higher end increase disproportionately. But also, only 10% of households own more than one property. Majority of people only own one property. And of course, as well, there's a major question of wealth. How useful or how is it to consider wealth when you have an asset that doesn't generate an income, or if you're paying a mortgage on it. Housing inequalities as well. We look at spatial inequality, in particular inequalities of place, particular areas around the country which have suffered from disinvestment and state neglect, parts of which are considered disadvantaged communities, poor quality housing. We have groups disproportionately affected by housing inequalities, lower income groups, lone parents, migrants, travellers, and those with a disability, those with disabilities. And in many ways these get lost within the wider housing picture and the role of housing in the economy. So the question is, why do we have these inequalities? And it is, I would argue, down to this pursuit of this neoliberal policies, which are essentially this process of marketization and financialization of the state. And going in a big theory picture, really going at it, essentially capitalism changed, or in the 1970s, different arguments around it, but we have the process of the period of Keynesian capitalism, large role of the state in providing welfare, public services, strongly regulated, to post-1970s, a period of deregulation, of finance, of capital, and David Harvey and other urban geographers, critical, radical political economists would argue that this was a process of capital essentially trying to take back what had been won by labour, or what was given over to the welfare state and workers' wages. And also that there was a crisis in capital itself. It was looking for new ways to invest and to try and accumulate capital. And housing became seen, and property, as a really key area that deregulated finance could profit. It could use as a way to invest, to speculate, and you have this whole process then of financialization of housing. But it's also this process of what's called accumulation through dispossession. So all this social housing, local authority housing that had been built, that was sitting there, and in many ways it was not a market, it was uncommodifiable. So so capital wanted to open it up and say, well, here's somewhere where we can make a huge amount of return if we get more housing provided through the private market and less through the local authority or through the state. And we have within then these periods of 1980s, 1990s, this rising inequality where workers' wages are essentially, they're not increasing to the same extent. So you have this requirement, in order to keep up demand within capitalism, this requirement to take on debt. How can workers take on debt? They use their house as an asset to release equity, which then feeds into the demand of the system and keeps the economy going. And at the same time, you have the top, as inequality increases, the top global wealthy want to find areas to invest and get a high return, property being a key area. So in this way, we have to understand housing's role in the wider, and property in the wider political economy of capitalism and what's happening within capitalism. Because what is happening is that capital is looking, as I said, for somewhere to invest. Housing is a key area to do that, and property as well. And of course what that means is that the state directly, the argument is to give it less of a role in that these areas should be opened to profit from. So that's the theory, and we can see it playing out in terms of Ireland. In particular, if we look at the decline in the local authority building, and we can see we had our period of austerity in the 1980s, where local authorities were no longer allowed to borrow to build housing, which was a big shift. And also then we see that reduction in that period. Then we see the increase through the 1990s, and of course austerity hits then from 2010 onwards, this absolute collapse in the construction of housing. And why I would argue that austerity continued the neoliberal approach was because social housing was disproportionately cut during the austerity period, as was capital more generally, capital investment in things like roads, housing, schools, because it was seen as politically easier to cut. But I would also argue that social housing, there was an ideological opposition to social housing, and therefore it was easier to cut, and the desire was to actually cut it. And I've calculated that over this period, if austerity hadn't happened, we would have an additional 25,000 local authority houses built. So we would not have the housing crisis we have without the political choices, if the political choices that were taken then were different. If, for example, we decided to tax wealth, if we decided to spread the cuts around broader and not just target areas like social housing, or if we decided to make other decisions. But this was a political decision, and this is the political and social consequence of it. The housing crisis is not an accident, it is a direct result of political decisions. To go on to rebuilding Ireland now, because I know I'm actually really watching my time, to make broad points about rebuilding Ireland, on a number of areas at the start within the plan, there's some really good points made within it. It correctly identifies some of the key issues within the housing crisis, which are there in terms of, for example, the unacceptable level of families in emergency accommodation, the need to, they refer to moderate rental and purchase price inflation, though I think the aim should be to reduce them rather than just moderate them. It does refer to housing as a basic human and social requirement, but there's no mention in the document anywhere, this was pointed out to me by the Centre for Faith and Justice, no mention anywhere of the word human right to housing, nowhere in it, which I think tells a lot about the document and its perspective and priority and the plans. But it said there is positive statements. For example, it says that housing left to its own devices, the market would not ensure all households are housed appropriately or at all, which is the principal reason for the existence of a social housing programme. Correct. The market will not provide for housing for all households who can't afford housing. It also talks about the housing challenge is not just about providing more homes, it's about moving towards stable, cost-effective, affordable housing provision, the right levels of housing in the right places. And it says that increasing house prices may increase the wealth of some households, but also can increase costs for other less well-off households. And the state, therefore, has an important role in overseeing, regulating, managing the housing sector. And the provision of housing to those who need it is one of the state's primary responsibilities. Very good outlining principles for what the housing system should be about and doing. The problem is, the devil is in the detail. What is the actual practical policies implemented as a result? And within this, you could describe that I would think the social housing approach could be described in a very unkind way as manipulative and misleading. And maybe that's not just unkind, maybe that's the reality. But I've been following this since the previous plan, 2014 plan, and I've been trying to get to the detail of how many public houses are actually been built within these plans. And I've actually only in the last couple of weeks been really able to, through Dáil, looking at Dáil transcripts and housing statements, been really getting to the bottom of, well, actually how many houses are they planning to build? And when you look at, of course, what's happened is that essentially the social housing plan, 2014, this Rebuilding Ireland plan, they're not social housing strategies. They are privatisation strategies, essentially. They are strategies of converting social housing into a completely privatised, commodified, monetised approach reliant on the private market. If we look at this, this is the graph the plan uses, which says the spectrum of social housing forecast over the 2016-2021. The big blue line, the light blue, which is the largest part of the graph, is accommodation provided through the private rental sector. The housing assistance payment, the rental accommodation scheme, also leasing is in there in the green. The actual build is the smallest dark blue part. The actual build. What all of us would assume when you look at that graph and would see social housing, you would assume it's all build at least, or maybe there's some purchase. But you wouldn't think private rental accommodation would be in there. But this is what has happened, and the minister has even changed the language. They're no longer social housing units, they're social housing solutions. What a lovely way to describe it. I don't mean to be dismissive or whatever, unkind again. I think it's actually quite manipulative, and it's directly meant to be. It's no longer new build social housing, it's social housing solutions. Because they talk about this in terms of it that, and this description, that in the rebuilding plan, 111,000 households will have their housing need met by the various private rental schemes. 111,000. So then the other figure that he talks about, and it's the headline figure within the plan, is the 47,000 social housing units, new social housing units. Now to break that down, in the initial plan when it was released there was no breakdown of these figures, there was just the graph. So I was doing a lot of deduction from measuring the image. And I roughly got to about what has now been come out. The argument essentially that there's no real building. So 26,000 units, it says, of these 47,000 will be built. Okay, so we're immediately roughly halving in terms of what will be built. 11,000 to be acquired from the market, 10,000 to be leased from the market. 5 minutes, oh dear.
Four actually.
4 actually,
okay.
Right, so essentially, that when you break it down, I calculate when you take out, because within the The construction is part 5, is voids and refurbishing voids. Are they new builds? No, they shouldn't be classified as new builds. You actually get down to about, I calculated 3,000 units, new units per annum over the coming years. I just looked last night at Dáil statements. Minister Coveney said, actually referred to this year, there will be about 2,300 units delivered by local authorities, which includes refurbishment and regeneration. Housing bodies 550, which gives you under 3,000 per year new build. Now, it gets even more worrying, because if you look at the Dublin City Council figures, we see that what they have set out in terms of new builds is even, in terms of looking at the figures, that within these figures of the new build, housing HAP is brought back in again as a delivery of actual what you think would be permanent social housing. Restoration of voids is in there, regeneration of estates is in there. These are 2016 figures, and as far as I can see, there's just 9 local authority housing units new built by Dublin City Council. Now that's not regeneration, but they're existing social housing estates, but yet you have 20,000 in the housing waiting list. You can divide 9 into 20,000 and see how long it will be meeting the housing list. But this is even more worrying, I think, is this this is Dublin City Council setting out how many units are going to be delivered over the coming years. I'm really struggling to see where the significant rebuilding is. I can see the social housing PPP units giving a big delivery, but if you go through it, you actually see there's no major increase, no significant increase in rebuilding. And within it, a lot of it is part 5 and regeneration estates. So an argument I would really like to make is that the private rental approach is not social housing, and it is wrong to classify it as social housing because it doesn't provide tenants with security of tenure, it doesn't allow them to set up a home, but importantly, it doesn't increase supply. The government has gone on with the need to increase supply. It does not increase supply of real permanent social homes, and actually it exacerbates the crisis. You don't even think of it logically. A third of private rental units, all private rental units, are some form of social housing subsidy, subsidised social housing. That is actually adding to the crisis in the private rental sector. And they want to get even more housing from the private rental sector. So surely that's just going to increase prices and exacerbate that crisis. And there is an issue around the housing assistance payment, that whether people are on the housing waiting list, whether they're taken off them, is this a political attempt? There's a lot more to be said about this plan. In particular, I've analysed the whole role of off-balance sheet mechanisms. If you look at this within the plan, the major area of housing delivery is through these mechanisms, these off-balance sheet mechanisms, and it's looking to real estate investment trusts to build social housing and private rental. A big part of it is to actually actively sell off state lands and transfer them to the private sector. And this is there at the heart of the strategy, using PPP models, and they refer to at one point transferring the land in support of the common good to developers. I don't see how that's supporting the common good. An example of this is, and they cite this, the Dublin City Council Lands Initiative, which is planning for 1,700 homes on public land, which was formerly, 2 of which formerly housed public housing estates, and only 30% of these will be social housing. 20% will be affordable rental, and 50% private homes. But the even more significant issue is that you can make a lot of critiques of them, but it's developers that are going to dictate the plans. It's the same problem as the old PPPs. But there's an even bigger problem. The off-balance sheet mechanisms have been shown not to work. The Department of Environment already this year, it was shown by RTE that they haven't been able to find mechanisms to provide social housing. The NTMA's Infrastructure Strategic Investment Fund also said that actually it hasn't been able to find any viable form of building social housing under these commercial bases. And interestingly, that's our state pension fund that they're using to work with large real estate investment funds to build commercial private housing. What? Should not be building social affordable housing? 8 billion of it. PPPs are a failed model. They're more expensive. They're completely dependent on the volatile private finance sector to build. And this approach is continued within Pillar 3 of the housing plan, which looks at the whole issue of land and correctly makes the argument that there's a major issue with land and land hoarding, but what's the solution? Give the land over to private developers, sell it off to private developers. And the theory is that by providing low-cost land to developers, this will increase competition within the land market. But there's no guarantee that this will provide affordable housing. I've raced through it a lot here. I think that essentially the problem with the plan and the government's approach, for example through real estate investment trusts, is essentially they are not prepared to increase investment in direct build local authority housing. And my time is really limited. There's lots here that you can look at another time. There is a bigger point to be made, which is I think that they're looking to international capital, the real estate investment trust, this build to rent sector as the way to increase housing supply. That this is the real issue, and so therefore they won't link rents to inflation, they won't give proper security of tenure. It's all about how can we attract in the private finance that will increase housing supply. Because they know the Irish housing system is broken. There's no lending going to happen from Irish banks to homeowners. There's no major lending going to happen to developers. So who's going to build the housing that we need? And their strategy is, and this isn't just an Irish strategy, it's happening in relation to the UK as well, is look to the big international investors to come in and build on a big scale. That's what their hope is. But of course the strategy is mad. You're relying on a private finance that is completely volatile, that might decide to buy property and leave it vacant. They might decide to buy land and leave it vacant. Like, for example, NAMA has sold land that could have built 20,000 housing units. Only 5% has been built. The private sector looks at housing and property as an investment. That's what it's about, prospective investment. It might build, it might not. So is that where we're putting the hope in building supply? And I think that's the heart of the problem. So, and if we look at some trends, what's happening in investment is we're seeing, this from CSO, if we look at the number of housing units that have been bought by, we're seeing last year 7,000 units were bought by a owner-occupier, first-time buyer, 8,000. The same amount were bought by a house buyer, but a non-occupier, that is bought for investment. So we're seeing the same number of units been bought as an investment as a first-time homeowner. So we're back to this whole area of housing being primarily an investment. And if you want to look at what the sort of why this is, the return, this is the Real Estate Investment Trust IRAs, showing a graph there in the bottom right of the return in investment, and that shows up to 1,000% they're claiming return on their investment since over the last number of decades anyway. So this is what the real estate investment trusts are advertising. Another example is and they talk about, this was taken from IRES's presentation to investors, and they talk about why international investors should invest in this real estate investment trust in Ireland at the moment, and they show essentially the fundamentals, what they call, of the housing market. You'll see it in their strong rental growth opportunities, land sales and property sales coming up from NAMA, and so you can see there that they are seeing that into the future in Ireland we're going to see continued rental price growth, opportunities from NAMA, property as investment, and this is from the NTMA, the National Treasury Management Agency, in a presentation to investors in January of last year. And we wonder why international investment is coming in here into our property, because I would argue, make the case that that's actually not a good thing, because it's building a certain type of property and pushing up prices. What they show here is that for residential property, until 2011, it made no sense for a foreign buyer to invest in Ireland, in the bottom one, in residential property. But in 2011 that changed and it became profitable. Obviously as rents rose, as prices rose, and then this difference between what you could borrow in terms of buy government bond, euro bonds, versus investment in residential, this gap increases. So they're saying to international investors, here it makes sense to invest here in the significant yields. This is also from the NTMA's presentation. They have one section in it called property, where they say property prices rising thanks to lack of supply, reasonable starting valuation and strong capital inflows. And the point being that the housing market recovery became part of the economic narrative of recovery and became a part of that for a number of reasons which I've outlined at other points, and I'm really going to finish now. So what are the solutions? The solutions are very clear, I think, and they're very straightforward. The state has to significantly increase its investment in building. It needs to start now, and people say, oh, that's a long-term solution. If they did it 2 years ago, we would have a significant amount. We have to start at some point. The current plan does not involve any significant build of local authority social housing. We need to be building 20,000 social and affordable homes per year, and additional 10,000 affordable homes of some form of non-commodified cooperative ownership or trust ownership that isn't going back into the market. You could have, the money is there, instead of scrapping the USC over the coming years, we could do it. We could borrow to do it. We could use, as Paul has suggested, use what comes back from the banks over the coming years to do it. You could allow local authorities to borrow. I've made an argument for a new affordable homes and community agency to be set up to deliver new forms of this, basically drive and deliver this, bring in housing associations. NAMA has a key role. It's going to build 20,000 units over the next few years. The majority, only 10% of those will be social. Why shouldn't they be all social and affordable? NAMA has paid back the majority of its debt. There's no issue with converting it into being an affordable homes agency. No issue whatsoever. It's a political decision. Credit unions have offered money. You could buy up the buy-to-lets. The whole issue of the social mix argument, it doesn't wash, because you could create a social mix if you increase the income eligibility thresholds for local authority housing, if you bring in other forms of cost rental, if you bring in affordable purchase that's linked in as well. I've made the argument that we need a new deal in housing. We need to think like back in the Roosevelt era, back in the point of really thinking big. And finally, there is a political opportunity now. There's a window of opportunity. The Irish people have shown, I think, in support of Apollo House, also in surveys, in the general election, they want the housing crisis dealt with, not in return to commodification, speculation, housing as an asset, but actually housing as a home and as a human right. That's what they want. The political opportunity is there, and I think that there is actually hope that this might happen, but it does need, I think, really concerted action by social movements, by policy makers, by policy influencers, academics, everybody to come together and say, do you know what, we need to completely change how we're doing things, and we need to do something radically different. The solutions are there. It is simply down to political priorities and political decision.
Thanks very much, Rory.